Hey folks, welcome to week 2 of GID 109, Intro to Web Design. Alright, so you'll notice that this video is dropping a little later than usual. Usually you will see your videos on the Sunday before classes start for that week, but I'm dropping this one on week 2 on Wednesday, simply because week 1, last week, our first week, we had a lot to digest. We had a lot to go over, and everybody's getting acclimated with class, getting used to things, just sort of figuring out how to use our Blackboard site and going over all the 2 videos that I gave you last week, which were pretty long. I do promise that from week to week the video lectures will generally be just one video, but like I said, week 1 we had a lot to cover, so I figured I'd give you a little extra time to digest it. Okay, so here we are back in Blackboard in our Blackboard course. We're going to go over to modules and projects. And remember last week, week 1, like I said, we went over a whole bunch of stuff. We went through the whole brief history of the web because you are going to get working on your historical speculative paper. And so you have to sort of know the history of the web a little bit so you can decide where to do your research. There was a history of the web video. And of course, we went through some example sites through the years. Not to mention the fact our first video last week was just sort of getting to know the course and how we're going to teach this class. So lots of stuff to go over. All you had to do for homework last week was to review the handout for the historical speculative paper that we are going to do very soon. So now we're in week 2, so let's go back to modules and see what's on the agenda for this week, which we're going to cover in this video right here. Now, this week is also kind of a preparatory week, but instead of focusing on the history of the web, we're going to focus on more practical things this week. We're going to talk about the course tools, resources, and project structure, because we have 2 major projects in this course, right? You have your research paper, which we talked about last week, but that's not really a project, that's a paper. We have 2 major web design projects to do, which eat up about half of the semester each, okay? So before we can get into those projects, we sort of have to understand the tools that we're going to use to build those projects. And so the 2 main tools we're going to focus on today in this video are Adobe XD, as well as our practice exercises for HTML and CSS, which of course are the 2 foundational coding languages for the web. Now you'll see here, of course, in the overview that we are also in this class going to use Photoshop and Illustrator. But in this class, we're not really teaching Photoshop and Illustrator because presumably by now you have already taken classes in those 2 pieces of software and are more familiar with it. This class, however, is probably the first time you've ever used Adobe XD, so we'll be spending the majority of our time working on that software. Okay, other things this week, we have consumables, right? Remember, there's no textbook in this class, but there is media right here that you have to consume or at least become familiar with. And so there's 3 links here, the Apple Design Resources page, Apple Fonts and User Interface Guidelines, and Apple Developer Site. Now, all 3 of these websites are what we call back-end developer websites, right? Let's take a look at them. Here's the Apple Design Resources. So these are websites that exist on the back end of Apple's main website, and this is for developers. And this is basically a really good overview of kind of Apple's philosophy and tools that they use for designing interfaces and websites for either the Mac OS, which is of course their desktop operating system, or the iOS, which of course is their mobile operating system, which works on their phones and tablets. And of course they even now have Watch OS, which is for the Apple Watch, and TV OS, which is for Apple TV. All we really care about is the Mac OS guidelines for this particular class, but certainly feel free to read through a bunch of their other stuff. They have downloadable attributes that you can use for different pieces of software, including XD, which you are free to use in this class. The other thing is the Apple Fonts and User Interface Guidelines. This I want you to become familiar with just for making design choices as we build our websites. Now you're probably wondering, why are we just looking at Apple resources? Well, because A, they're easy to access, and B, on a per capita basis in the United States, Apple products are more widely used than PC products. Now, it doesn't really matter in web design so much because things are accessed through web browsers, not necessarily dependent on operating systems. But I really just wanted to give you guys an overview of the sort of like design standards that are expected from certain companies when designing for different operating systems. This does not mean that you have to employ all of these in your projects you're doing for this class, but it's just textbook reading. I want you to become familiar with this stuff, okay? So this is Apple's fonts and fonts for Apple platforms pages, which kind of goes over specific fonts that Apple likes people using. It even allows you to download the fonts if you would like, which is kind of great. You can just get free fonts from Apple. These were designed for Apple many years ago. There's human interface guidelines. We're going to talk a lot in this class about user interface and user experience design. So certainly read through specifically for the Mac OS one, because we're not really working on mobile in this class. But take a look at the Mac OS human interface guidelines, which is this page here, which is taking forever to load, but you get the idea. So check that out, read through them. And there's some other interesting things here. Again, you don't have to have this stuff memorized. You don't necessarily have to employ it in your projects for this class, but I do want you to become familiar with their existence and what they have, okay? So that's sort of your textbook reading for the week, these 3 pieces of media. Okay, now, like I said, you have to review those Apple resources, right? Download anything that you think you might need, or just simply read through them. That is all that is due this week, okay? We'll talk about your homework coming out of this week in a little bit. But first, let's go into the major things this week, is getting to know Adobe XD and taking a look at our HTML and CSS exercises. Okay, let's start with Adobe XD. So by now, of course, you should have your Adobe Creative Cloud account all set up on your computer, and you should have access to all the Adobe software that you need. For this class specifically, it is, of course, Adobe XD, Photoshop, and Illustrator. Those are the 3 pieces of Adobe software we'll be using in this class. So make sure you have those downloaded on your computer, signed into your Adobe account, and you know that they work properly, okay? Make sure they start up and they run. So as long as you've done that, now we can dive into XD. Now, if you've used XD before and you're familiar with it, well, great, then you're a little bit ahead of the game here. But if not, this might be your first time using it. Maybe you've heard of it, or maybe you haven't heard of it, but now is an opportunity to use it. So this handout here, the All About Adobe XD handout, is going to get you started on this. We are also going to do some lessons in class on video that I will go over with you, but you've got to start learning the software on your own a little bit, just getting familiar with it. And here's some really good resources. So if you click this handout, it takes you to this here, and this is our handout, the All About Adobe XD handout. Pay no attention to this code up here. I use this for other classes too. So anywho, Adobe XD, if you're not familiar, is a vector-based user experience design tool which helps you create prototypes for websites, web apps, and mobile apps. XD supports website wireframing and creating simple, immersive, interactive click-through prototypes. There's a lot going on in that one paragraph. Let's talk about what that is. So one thing, you should be familiar with this phrase, vector-based, right? Because another Adobe product that you use, Adobe Illustrator, is also vector-based. Now, in a category of tools, right, you have sort of image creation and editing tools, which would be Photoshop and Illustrator. Photoshop is a pixel-based tool, and Illustrator is a vector-based tool. But both of them are used for creating images and documents and editing them, right? Now, when you need to actually make a published, finished project, you need what's called a layout program, right? And if we were doing this for print, we would be using Adobe InDesign, which you probably use in your other classes. But here for the web, we have other options. Now, we're not publishing directly to the web here, but we are creating interactive prototypes. Now, in the world of user experience design, which we'll learn more about as we go through here, the website design process goes through a variety of stages, and some of that is on paper, and some of that is through the ideation and brainstorming process. But you don't jump to just starting to code a website without building some prototypes first. And there are a variety of ways to make prototypes. For years, people would build them in Photoshop or Illustrator, simply using the layers palette to sort of replicate the way different web pages would interact. And then there was a third-party tool called Sketch, which has been around for a number of years, which comes out of Europe. And then recently, a couple of years ago, Adobe came came out with this program, Adobe XD, which allows you to build interactive prototypes. So they're not coded, they're all visual WYSIWYG designs, right? WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, right? And so if you know how to use Adobe Illustrator, or you've used Adobe InDesign, you should immediately be fairly familiar with the tools in Adobe XD. It's not entirely dissimilar. Now I will say that the interface to Adobe XD looks a little bit different, and you'll see that in a minute. But just so you know, again, it's a vector-based design tool, and it allows us to essentially create prototypes for anything that is web-enabled, right? So in this class, we're dealing with traditional desktop websites. But of course, if we were doing this in a mobile class, we'd be dealing with web apps or responsive design websites, mobile apps specifically, and of course, all sorts of other items that are web-enabled. Okay, so when XD first came into being, it was called Project Comet. That was sort of its working name. But then it was released in total in 2016. There were beta testing models before that. So this was developed in response to what I mentioned, which was Sketch, which came, it's a Dutch piece of software out of Europe. And Sketch became very popular. And of course, XD was a response to that. Adobe, over the past 10 years or so, has sort of tried to figure out what their best place to be is in terms of making available web design software. Back in 2001, Adobe purchased Adobe Dreamweaver from a company called Macromedia. And so that is a WYSIWYG and coding platform for building functioning websites. Unfortunately, over the years since 2001, Adobe has not put a lot of effort into updating the software, and it remains vastly similar to what it was when they first purchased it from Dreamweaver, so it hasn't really evolved. Adobe tried sort of a visual design program called Adobe Muse, which came out in 2012, which was very popular for a long time. But third-party web-based tools such as Squarespace and Wix and of course other tools where you basically build your website online and you get to customize a variety of templates either by writing code or using visual elements. WordPress, of course, is a super popular version of this. They basically sort of made Muse unnecessary, I guess. And so Adobe decided they weren't going to put their effort into that. And so in the world of prototyping, for user experience design, for user interface design, for user testing, which is really the front-end design of web design, which is really what this particular class focuses on, front-end user experience, user interface web design. There wasn't a lot of software that really did that well. Like I said, people were sort of customizing Photoshop and Illustrator for it, but that's not what those programs are designed for. And so Sketch was really the only game in town for a long time. And so, like I say, after not doing much with Dreamweaver and kind of a steering away from Adobe Muse, Adobe came up with XD. And really, this seems to be sort of their most popular and successful attempt at making web-specific software. And so anyway, that's why we're using it in this class, because it is a front-end user experience tool, and that's what we're doing here. Okay, so essentially, the nice thing about this program is that if you become familiar with Adobe XD, which you are going to, of course, you could then pick up Sketch. So if you are working in the industry doing front-end UX web design, and the place you're working for uses Sketch, you'll be familiar with it almost out of the gate because they're very similar. The nice thing about Adobe XD, of course, is it's part of the Adobe Creative Cloud suite, and so it easily interfaces with the other software that we use, like Photoshop and Illustrator. Now, we have to learn this software for this class. Now, I am going to show you some things on video when we do future video lectures. But before I get to showing you my stuff, I want you to start getting familiar with the program on your own. And so this handout has a variety of good resources. So it starts here with useful videos. You can go to Adobe XD's homepage, which is this here, which doesn't really have learning tools, but if you want to become familiar with just how the program works, certainly read through their homepage. Now, of course, this is their marketing advertising page, which tells you all the wonderful things about Adobe XD, and it is wonderful. But of course, just note that this is written from a marketing point of view. But I still think it's a good place to start because it gives you a really good idea what the software is designed for, right? Then the next thing is I have 4 YouTube videos here, which are all just sort of like introductory basics, right? Obviously, the first one you're going to start with is Adobe XD Intro and Basics, which is this video here. It's only 34 minutes long. It's a half-hour lesson. So, download the software, open up the software, watch the video, and then practice with some of the things that this video is showing you. What's great about sort of video learning like this is you can pause the video, go practice some of the things they're showing you how to do, and then go back and start the video again. And of course, you can repeat things. Once you become comfortable with the basics, you can move on to these other ones, right? There's creating prototypes, using wires and previews, experience design, making links between pages, and of course, this is prototyping and sharing. Now, between now and next week, I don't expect you to get through all of these. That's a lot. What I'm showing you here is the resources you're going to use for teaching yourself and learning Adobe XD throughout the entire semester. Plus, of course, I am going to be going over things myself on these video lectures. So the nice thing is you'll be able to play around with the software yourself, because playing with it is important, just to sort of mess around with it, following some of these videos, and then doing the stuff I show you. Now, if you find that you are getting really good at Adobe XD and you're comfortable using it and you're like, you know what, I want to really dive deeper into it and get more structured in how I'm using it, the second page of this handout here goes into some sort of advanced courses you can use. Again, pay no attention to the paragraph at the top. I do use this handout for other classes too, but it's the same thing. So this one here, the Adobe XD course, is presented by this guy, Greg Rogg, who has 50 lessons that are each under 12 minutes each. And here's an example of some of the topics that he covers. This is the link to his course, and it's completely free, which is amazing. It's literally, 50 12-minute lessons, so it's a couple hours worth of Adobe XD lessons for free. So I certainly recommend taking advantage of that. There are so many websites like Skillshare and Lynda through LinkedIn where you have to pay to do the online lessons, but this guy has just given the stuff away, and he's really good at it. So certainly once you get comfortable with the basics of XD, at any point in the next few weeks, sort of dive into these and learn more, right? And then if you're not really into sort of YouTube videos for learning, Adobe has their own XD tutorials, which you can find here, which I'm linked to, which are very sort of specific and more modular. And as you can see, they're all very short. 4 minutes, 20 minutes, 8 minutes, 3 minutes. So you can definitely check out these 5 lessons too for the getting started, and then there's more lessons for setting up a project, working with images, so on and so forth. So again, I do not expect you to go through every resource in this 2-page handout. But what I am is I'm giving you resources to get started with Adobe XD. Now, if we were meeting in class in person, this would be different. We'd be able to have more time in class to play around with the software together as a group, help each other out. But since we're working in an online environment, working completely remotely, you're going to have to take some of the learning into your own hands a little bit more, which means being a little more proactive in learning the software. Hopefully by now, with some knowledge of Photoshop and Illustrator, you're excited about learning new software and you're ready to go. So hopefully you'll find some of these resources useful. Again, you probably don't need all of them, but try the ones that you think are going to be most helpful to you. Now, since we've talked about Adobe XD so much, let's take a quick look at it. So I'm going to just minimize this for a second here. So when you first open up Adobe XD, this is what you see here, right? We've got this. Let me just minimize a few things here. I got way too many things open. So this is your landing screen for Adobe XD when you first open it up. And similar to Photoshop and Illustrator, it does have this sort of get started page. What's nice is you start out with your size and your destination. So if you're designing for an iPhone 10, 10s, or 11 Pro, you can just go ahead and click this and pick from the pull-down menu, right, what type of item you're using. Notice that, of course, it's not just Apple-specific. Of course not. Adobe allows you to design for a variety of platforms, both Android-based, Windows-based, Apple-based, so on and so forth. So you can design for the Google Pixel, etc., etc. But now in this class, again, this is a web design class, not a mobile design class. So we are interested in this button right here, which is the desktop website button, which is much easier because there's less choices. Because when you're designing for a desktop model, you're really just dealing with a horizontal page configuration. So there's only three: 1920 by 1080, 1366 by 768, or 1280 by 800 pixels. There are, of course, social media posts you can design too, which we're not doing for this class, but I just want to point it out to you. And the old custom size. You can type in whatever size you want if you were building a custom site for somebody and didn't want to go with a preset size. All right, so just for the sake of argument, we're going to grab the Web 1921, and as soon as you pick it, it opens up the workspace, and you can immediately tell in opening this up that this is a much less complex program than, say, Photoshop or Illustrator. Because XD is a new program, it does not have the weight of the history that, say, Photoshop and Illustrator has, where so many tools, so many functions, so many templates have been added to it over the years, and they don't subtract any of them. It just gets more and more complex. You probably noticed this when you were learning Photoshop and Illustrator. XD, on the other hand, is pretty simple. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a rich and powerful tool. It is. It just means that it's not confusing with all the tools. So basic workspace is this. Up on the left-hand side here, we have your toolbar, which is where Adobe always puts the toolbar. But notice that there's way fewer tools than you find in Photoshop and Illustrator, right? And you'll recognize a bunch of these, right? There's your selection tool, your rectangle tool, your ellipse tool, your polygon tool, your line tool, your pen tool, the type tool, the artboard tool, and the magnifying glass, the zoom tool. Now, every single one of those exists in Adobe Illustrator, and they all function similarly. So if you know Illustrator, you immediately know how to use these tools. So you're already off and running, right? Then you have your Assets panel, which if you are familiar with Adobe InDesign, that will be familiar to you. The Layers panel lives down here. These are your layers, or your artboards, as they're called here in Adobe XD. Again, something you should be somewhat familiar with. Then over here in the middle is the workspace. This is your artboard. Works just like the artboards in Illustrator. Just notice the anchor points here are round as opposed to squares, but other than that, it's the same. You can drag guides in from the edges just like you can in Illustrator, right? Instead of dragging them from the rulers, you're just dragging them in from the edges. You can rename the artboard simply by clicking on the name, right? Calling it whatever you want. And if you zoom out, of course, you'll see that just like in Adobe Illustrator, you have a lot of workspace, and you can put more and more artboards. Because, of course, websites have multiple screens, and each artboard represents a screen. All right, let's zoom back in. Now, of course, this is the width and height of a typical 19 by 20 by 1080 pixel website. But if you have a website where it's just a above the fold rectangular screen, meaning that all of the content for a particular web page just lives in this one rectangle, then you're good to go. But if you have a scrolling website where content continues past the initial window, right? Well, all you have to do is grab the lower anchor point here and click it and drag, and you'll see that that dotted line represents the bottom of the screen size, the bottom of what we call above the fold, right? But then as I drag downwards, I am extending the length of the website to be whatever I need it to be. Pretty great, right? So that's instant scrolling right there. Then over here on the right-hand side, you have the palettes. Now, unlike Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, where you have dozens of palettes to fish through, you instead get the palette you need based on what is on the screen. So for example, if I were to draw a rectangle, right, just like I would in Adobe Illustrator, as soon as I'm done drawing it, Adobe XD hands me the palettes that it thinks I need to work with that rectangle. It's like a golf caddy, right? Anybody here golf? I don't golf. I've seen this on TV. But basically, when you are a golf caddy, you hand the club that you think the golfer is going to need for wherever they are in the course. So you're helpful, right? This set of palettes here in Adobe XD works exactly the same way. I make a rectangle. Adobe XD says, hey, we think you need these palettes to work with this rectangle. And what are my palettes that it gave me? The alignment buttons, which you should know from Adobe Illustrator, right? I can change the width and the height of the rectangle by typing in some numbers. I can rotate the rectangle by putting in a number of degrees. I can reflect the rectangle, right, or flip it. I can also go ahead and change the appearance by adjusting the opacity of it. I can round the corners. I can add fill color by clicking on fill, and this takes me to the Adobe XD color picker. I can change the border color the same way. I can change the size of the border, and so on and so on and so on. Many of the tools and palettes over here you will be familiar with from Illustrator. Some of them you will not be, and that's okay. That's where we have to learn the different pieces of Adobe XD. So the other thing about XD that's pretty fabulous is that it handles drag and drop. So if I have a folder full of photographs that I've already optimized for the web in Photoshop, I can simply just drag them onto the workspace and they work perfectly. Same thing with vector objects that you've created in Illustrator, things like logos and graphics and whatnot. Now, the only other thing I want to show you in XD right now, before we launch into other things, is the 3 tabs at the top. There's basically 3 stages of creating things in Adobe XD. The first tab is Design. This is where we design our pages. We add our elements. We put in our typography. We basically do the visual design of it. The next stage is Prototype, which allows you to create connections between objects and other pages or other objects by dragging out these blue wires. These will create the interactivity replications that you will see in the prototype. And then once you're done building your website, you simply go to Share, and that gives you options for how to share the website, either by creating a link or uploading it to Adobe's servers. At any point in the process, while you are either in prototype or design or whatever, you can come over here to the right and click the play button, and that will give you a live preview of your website, and you can test out all the links and the interactivity. It's pretty great. Now, I don't want to get too deep into it because this is literally day 1 of Adobe XD, but download the software, make sure it works, open it up, play around with it, and then dive into some of those intro videos that I showed you. Okay, next on the agenda today, let's go back over here. So next on our week 2 overview is we're getting into HTML and CSS. Now, in conjunction with learning Adobe XD and building prototypes of 2 major website projects, you guys are going to be practicing with lessons on how to write HTML and CSS. Maybe you have a little experience with coding already, maybe you don't, but we are going to use this handout here, the HTML and CSS handout, which is going to hook us up with a website called Code Academy. Now, you might be familiar with Code Academy, but they are essentially an online training system for learning code. Now, many of their lessons you have to pay for, but what's great is that a number of their lessons are free, and they offer new free lessons every month. So what you guys are going to do this week is just go to codeacademy.com, which we have here. This is Code Academy right here. And you're going to log in. You're going to make yourself an account. Now, you can either make a unique account for Code Academy, or if you want, you can go to Login and then choose one of these options down below to log in. I don't recommend ever logging into third-party websites with Facebook, but Google is not a bad option. So you can go to that, sign in with your Google account, which I already did, which is why I went to me directly here, but you can do that. And you can see again that there's a free version here. Now, this handout back here will sort of walk you through the steps for setting up an account and becoming familiar with the lesson modules, right? We essentially want to go to Catalog, and we're looking for Introduction to HTML and Learn CSS. These are the 2 courses at Code Academy that you have to complete before the semester is over. Okay, so you have all semester to do these. They're like miniature lessons on how to write code, and I'm going to show you how they work in a minute. If you do any other lessons beyond this on your own, you'll get extra credit, which is great, but you don't have to. Just have to do Intro to HTML and Learn CSS. So you might be wondering, why are we doing this and working with Adobe XD, which is a front-end prototyping tool? Because even though in this class we are not strictly learning to code, as a web designer, even if you only do front-end web design, it is important and incumbent on you to learn the basics of computer coding, to learn the basics of web coding, so you are not only familiar with it and that you can write code yourself, but so that you don't design websites, even from a front-end perspective, that cannot be coded efficiently. Meaning that it's important to sort of understand how it works. So back in the world of print design, right, you might never become an actual offset printer. You might never work at a print shop, but you should understand how offset and 4-color printing works, so that when you have to design things to be printed, you can work with a printer and understand what can be created and what cannot be created, what costs a lot of money and what's inexpensive to do, what's easy to do and what's difficult to do. Basically, you need to know enough about printing so you don't drive the printer crazy, right? And so that you're designing something appropriately. Same thing with web design. You might never become an expert coder, but you should know enough about code, particularly HTML and CSS, so that when you are working with a web developer to help build the websites that you are designing things that are appropriate and that don't drive the developer crazy. Same sort of concept. So we are going to be using Codecademy so that you can learn the basics of HTML and the basics of CSS. Okay, now of course we're going to talk about the workspace in a minute, but this is what the modules look like in Codecademy. So let's jump over there and take a look. So once you're logged into Codecademy, right, you can just go to Catalog up here in the left-hand top and go to HTML and CSS. Notice that you can learn all these different coding languages here in Codecademy. So if you really are into coding and you fall in love with this stuff, you can certainly learn more. But anyway, all we care about for this class is HTML and CSS. And like I said, the first one you're going to go with is Learn HTML. It's completely free, which is great. So you hop in there and you can read the overview of what the course is all about. It only takes 9 hours total to complete the course, approximately. Everybody's different, but this is what they're estimating. You can read the syllabus for the course if you would like. That just sort of gives you an overview of it. You do not have to do every piece of it, right? You don't have to do the quizzes because that requires a pro account, which requires you to pay for it, and I don't need you to do that. I just need you to learn the basics, right? So all you're really doing is Intro to HTML and HTML document standards, okay? And then once you are familiar with it, you can go ahead and hit start and it will take you to the workspace. Now again, this is self-paced. You can do this on your own, and as long as all of the lessons are done by the end of the semester, you are fine. Now you'll notice that inside this Intro to HTML course, there are 16 mini lessons down the bottom here. You start with number 1. So how does this work? Well, you'll notice there's 3 columns, 1, 2, 3. The left-hand column are the instructions of what you're going to do. So just literally read through it and follow the instructions. You'll notice that it's not super long. There's not a lot to do in the first lesson. So read through it, follow the instructions. Then when it tells you to do something, right, when it says in the code editor, do this, you go over here to the middle and this is the code editor. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to do exactly what it tells us to do. In between these 2 brackets, we're going to type the word run, right? And then once you've done something here in the code editor, you're going to go ahead and hit the run button. And what you've just done now appears over here in the right-hand column. Now this right-hand column you can consider like a miniature web browser, right? It's like a miniature Safari or Chrome or whatever. So follow the lesson, write the code, hit the run button, see what it does over here, and then go back and do it again, right? Follow the directions, do it again. What if I want to change it and say, you know, hello class? I can do that, hit run, and it appears here. So it's a great way to learn very small lessons in coding in HTML, actually do the coding here, and then see what it would look like in a web browser. Once you've completed this lesson, and you got to the end of it and you feel as though that you're totally happy with it, go ahead and hit next and you can move to the next lesson, and so on and so on and so on. When you complete all 16 of these lessons, you are going to get sort of a certificate or a screenshot or a badge of completion that will say you have completed this lesson 100% of it and you're all done with it. When you have completed it, you're going to simply take a screenshot of that and then go back over here to our Blackboard, and you're going to upload that screenshot to our projects, which we will get to later. You don't have to worry about it right now, but we'll take a look at it later on as we go. It'll be in here under the projects folder. There'll be a place for you to upload your screenshots to prove that you've made it through all the lessons. Now, again, between now and next week, I don't expect you to do a ton of that. Just get signed into Codecademy and maybe get started on the first lesson. So all we're doing this week is getting familiar with XD and getting familiar with Codecademy and our Learn HTML lesson. Once you've completed that, you have finished what you got to do for the week. Now, the reason why we have so much preparation in this class, why we're spending so much time getting used to things and going over it, is because the projects we're going to work on are pretty big and detailed, and so we want to make sure that we are familiar with our software and our tools. Now, back to modules for a second. Oh, I jumped ahead to week 3 here. Back to week 2. So your only other homework for this week, other than getting rolling with XD and getting rolling with Codecademy, is to begin your historical speculative paper. Do the background research part. Okay, by now you have probably chosen a piece of history of the web that you want to research and come up with a question about and write about. Remember, if all the projects are right here, and so you want to make sure that you go down here and go to the historical speculative paper, right? So this is part 1. Background research. This is what you're doing first, okay? So make sure you read through this. You can download the whole project as a PDF if you would like, but follow all these directions, right? There's a good chunk of stuff to read there. So that's what you're going to do for homework. So that's your main piece of homework, right? Get rolling with XD, get rolling with Codecademy, and you're good for the week, okay? So it's a good amount to do this week, but you should be fine. Next week, preview. What are we doing in week 3? Well, you can check out the module here, and you can see that next week we're going to dive into the whole concept of user experience design, right? So that'll still give you plenty of time to work on your paper and practice with XD and work in Codecademy. All right, so if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns, or whatnot, be sure to email me. Well, remember, every Monday and Friday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., I am on Zoom for open office hours, so be sure to drop in, say hello, ask questions, show me what you're working on, or whatever. I would love to see everybody. Since we're working completely online, I don't have the benefit of getting to see your faces, so certainly drop in on Zoom. Remember, you can find that information under announcements right here, Professor Previtt's online office hours. So come in and see me Friday or Monday. All right, you guys have a great day.